I'm an American who now lives in Venice and am director of MUSICA Venezia, a group that organizes very beautiful, special events. While I was in America, I was a professor of Russian culture, and I taught, and I published articles, and I published books on Russian art, Russian theater, Russian ballet, and Russian music. And my favorite course was the Russian avant-garde. I gave lectures on Stravinsky, Kandinsky, Shostakovich, and of course Skrjabin. And then, during the time I was in America, I had a grant to go to Germany, and while I was there, I went to Kazan, because I had discovered the name of Bulat Galyev, who had formed a group in Kazan called Prometheus to work on multimedia and something called light music, because not easy music, but light, lucha, because he created multimedia events in which he would project colored light in different intensities at different tempos. And he wrote a book on the aesthetics of multimedia and said, initially, we all had multimedia. We had rituals where there was dancing and costume and music. And then in the Renaissance, suddenly we separated out all the arts. There were concerts of music. There was art, especially by itself. And now we have come back to enjoying the beauty of multimedia when many of the different arts work together to form a whole. And now, however, we have electricity and colored light, which never existed before in the early stages. And now I have also had the opportunity in Venice to meet two remarkable people. One is Carlo Montanaro, the former director of the Academy of Arts and a professor of film, whose knowledge of many aspects of the visual media is very impressive, and Marco Palladin, who is the musical director of the La Fenice and has created many interesting musical events for me with very difficult scores. We all collaborated, the three of us, on Ballet Mécanique, and Professor Montanaro provided a version of it that was incredible in color, and Marco Palladin put together 4 pianists and 10 percussionists to work with Carlo on coordinating the film and the music. Then I discovered this year that it was the 100th anniversary of Skrjabin, and I knew I had to do something special. And all my life I wanted to do a version of Prometheus. And I then began to do some work on what had been done before and found out my knowledge of Skrjabin himself and his ideas was rather superficial. And so I read many books in Russian, in German, in English, and I discovered on YouTube that a woman named Anna Gauboy at Yale University, while still a student, had done a version of Prometheus recently. And her version was to shine colored light, different colored light in the hall. But I discovered that in an article that she had written that there's a problem that she had solved. What Skrjabin had done is created the first multimedia piece that ever existed. In 1911, it was published, Prometheus. And this was the time when light had been used in the theater only to illuminate the stage so the audience could see it. But beginning with that time and including out of Appia, colored light became a component of the total art form. And what Skrjabin did was to create a disc that hung from the ceiling with different colored transparent light bulbs and attached by a wire to a keyboard. And it was associated with the music so that different colored lights would be reflected on the ceiling while he was playing. But that was only a primitive version of what he really wanted. And like Kandinsky, who wrote The Yellow Sound, we have people who have very innovative ideas, but the technology is not there yet. And he also is one of the people that is actually in a way ignored. We all know Schoenberg, who was the extreme development of Wagner and Mahler and what they had done, and he went beyond them. And there was Stravinsky, who was the product of Mussorgsky and Rimsky-Korsakov, and their experiments using rhythms and harmonies of Russian folk music and also the liturgy. But Skrjabin was not part of this neo-Russian movement. He was sui generis. He was all by himself and independent. He certainly knew about Stravinsky. He certainly knew about Schoenberg, but he created his own way of writing music, which was to go beyond what we know as the major and minor, and created something called the Prometheus Chord, with 6 notes with certain intervals, and the whole piece of Prometheus is based on just this structure. And so we should pay homage to him as a great composer who changed the whole course of the history of music. And the third component that is so important about Skrjabin is his what he did with the idea of program music. Absolute music, like a quartet by Mozart, does not trigger off any ideas about the real world. But a music by Vivaldi, for example, called the Four Seasons, especially autumn, you have a program where while you're listening to the music, you think about something specific, like the peasants dancing, the drunken peasant who is falling asleep, the hunt. And so Wagner, he also took an idea from Wagner, which is the leitmotif. So you have specific melodies associated with a person, like the Rhine Maidens, an object, like the Rhine Gold, or something abstract, like the downfall of the gods. But Skrjabin did something unique. He created a philosophical story. And he created certain melodies that went with these particular ideas, like joy, languor, passivity, melancholy. And the whole piece of Poem of Ecstasy, Vers les Flammes, and Prometheus are based on the transition and development from a state of languor, passivity, a feeling that the world is dead, and suddenly joy and ecstasy and sunlight come into the world through man's will, and finally all humanity can reach this spiritual level that never existed before through the music that a composer creates. So what he did was also based on Madame Blavatsky. Madame Blavatsky was a Russian woman who looked at the Indian sources and created an idea that we all live in a world that's the 5th stage of the creation of the world. And at first, again, it was chaos, formless, passive, quiet, darkness. And suddenly, there is the spirit that introduces joy and light and will. But in Prometheus, that stage is only the 5th stage because man is devoted to pleasure and sensuality. And we have to go through the next 2 stages to reach the idea of divine ecstasy, when spirit is dominating again, but in a very positive way. And what did he do in terms of the light in Prometheus? The light itself is associated with certain motifs. So languor, melancholy, passivity is blue and green. And then when you have the idea of will, all of a sudden the brass is playing a melody that's very strong and very powerful, but only for a minute. And then what happens is that there's a struggle between this idea of this sterility and passivity and quiet and the will and joy until that starts to take over completely. And only at the very end, is this ecstatic spirituality attained. And so the colors go back to blue and green, but it's not the same as the beginning. It's the third highest stage. And if people don't understand this philosophical program, they miss half of the piece. Now, he not only got his ideas from Madame Blavatsky, but what happened in Russia throughout their history is sometimes they would borrow something like the idea of the Baroque from Italy and transform it through their own personality and culture to create something different. So when they built an Orthodox church in the Baroque style, it had to be a cube because that's the only thing allowed in an Orthodox church. And so what he did was he took ideas from Madame Blavatsky and used them for his own ends, making the musician, the composer, the theurg, the person who is actually going to change humanity and give them hope and energy to change the world. Where did he get these ideas? Not from Madame Blavatsky, but from Nietzsche. And Nietzsche was very popular at the time in Russia. In fact, it may seem strange, but Maxim Gorky took a lot from him, where the peasants said it's God's will that we must suffer, and he said nonsense, and the workers as well, that we have energy and strength and we can change the world. And so that's the idea that he got from Nietzsche. Nietzsche has often been distorted as the precursor to Nazism, but what he was doing was to giving ideas like that to people like Skrjabin, who used it in his music to say, I am the Superman, but the Superman is not someone who wants power in order to destroy and control. The Superman in this interpretation is someone who has dedicated his life to bringing people up and giving them the courage to change their lives. There's one problem with Prometheus that was difficult to solve for many, many years. Skrjabin, in his score, wrote 2 lines of music that look like music on a staff, but no one knows what the notes mean and what colors they indicate. And only in 1978 did it become clear. For the last 5 years of his life, just like Boswell with Samuel Johnson and Robert Kraft with Stravinsky, there was a man named Leonid Sabaneyev who would write down all the conversations he had with Skrjabin. And one day, he took him in 1913 to a restaurant called the Prague Restaurant in Moscow and said, okay, you are not leaving here, my dear, unless you write down the colors over every measure so we know what colors you want for the music at any point in time during the piece. And Skrjabin indeed wrote the names of the colors on a published piece of music. It was published by Kusevitsky, who we know as the conductor, but he started a very important publishing company. And when Skrjabin was in trouble finding a publisher, he published his works. And so what happened to the score? It disappeared until 1978, when Sabaneyev, who had left Russia after the revolution to go to Paris, he took this with him, and he gave his entire archive to the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, which is now in Paris. And I found this out through this article by Anna Gorboy, that's where it existed. So I had to go and look at the score. Instead of going to Paris, there's a wonderful interlibrary loan at the Marciano Library, and Chiara Mira gave me the opportunity to buy a copy of the score, which we got. And the Russian was difficult to read, but there was a book by a Russian woman in German that wrote down all the measures with exactly the colors. And so we were able to do it. And Michele Del Preta, a composer, worked with Igor Imhoff, who created these amazing, not just pure colors, but light designs that were projected on the walls of the palace, using this program of which colors are to be used in which sequence. And so what we have is a product that is incredible because we now follow the philosophical program. We have also used the colors that Skrjabin himself wanted, and we have used advanced modern technology to do what a person like Igor, with his capabilities and talent, can do to create designs that were incredible. And it's a really different experience to see something on a screen as opposed to projected on this enormous wall of the Palazzo Nobia here in Venice.